You're listening to Savory. It's a podcast about the people and processes behind food production and the politics that shape our understanding of the food system. I'm your host, Marika Dunham. On this episode of Savory, I interview Michi Hunter, who is a Quest University alumni and currently working with the nonprofit Young Agrarians.
So I guess a little bit about myself. I went to Quest University, graduated in 2015, took 5 years to do the degree, which I recommend to everybody. And after I graduated, I was roped into joining the Squamish Climate Action Network. I had worked on a bunch of sustainability initiatives while I was at Quest, just a bunch of different things, not necessarily related to the food system at all. And I was working with Krystle TenBrink on Quest staff with that work. And she roped me into Squamish Can. She was the president at the time. And she was like, Michi, you need to be on this board. We really would love your skills. And I had no idea what Squamish Can was. I thought they just taught canning workshops, but it stands for Climate Action Network. So I joined the board, not knowing what I was getting into at all. And it kind of just grew from there into working on and managing a bunch of their different projects, mostly in the food system, which is what interested me. I kind of come at the food system work from a climate change lens perspective, for sure. I've always been interested in climate issues ever since I was a kid. My mom was a great influence for me in that way. And I also really like growing food, just gardening and beekeeping and all that kind of thing. So I think that climate change passion, also interested in growing food, I think it's a good combination to feel really good about what I'm doing and also be working in an area that I like. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I got into the food system world.
Mm-hmm. And so how long have you been working in nonprofits since you started at Squamish Can?
Yes, I have been working like summer jobs at different nonprofits while I was at Quest. The One Straw Society on the Sunshine Coast. They do a ton of gardening and food security projects. I worked at a botanical garden, which is also a nonprofit. That was such a fun job. And also didn't work, but volunteered in a few school initiatives in high school and at Quest as well. Student council, various clubs, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering how else you've been engaged with the food system. If you could tell me a little bit more about your honey business and how that got started.
For sure. Yeah. So me and my partner are part-time beekeepers now. We started our business called Green Bee Honey in 2015 in Squamish, just with a few hives. Darwin actually caught a swarm in Dentville, downtown Squamish. It was on somebody's lawn, and he'd never caught a swarm before, so he had me on the phone. I'd done it once, and he scooped them up into a cardboard box with a broom, brought them home, and then built a beehive the next day and put them in it. And that was how his beekeeping adventure started. I had worked a little bit with bees at the botanical garden I worked at the Sunshine Coast and at a farm in New Zealand. And I totally got bit by the bee bug, not literally, but I just thought it was such a fascinating creature to be working with, and how you get honey and their life cycles and social hierarchy in the hive is so interesting. And I really liked that I was potentially contributing in a positive way to the food system. I don't think keeping bees is good for the environment at all, because honeybees are non-native to North America and they can actually compete with native bees for food. But we try to incorporate some other big picture positive things in our beekeeping. So we are working on a few breeding projects to breed bees that are more resistant to mites and diseases, so that we don't need to keep dumping as many chemical treatments into the hive. And that's a way that we feel that we're contributing positively to the industry.
Mm-hmm. Wait, can I ask you, what does it mean to catch a swarm?
Oh, yeah. So when a hive is doing really well, the population gets too big for the hive or the space that they're in. And so they will start raising a few new queens. And half of the hive will go with the old queen and just leave the hive. And they will usually just kind of fly all in the air for a while and then find usually a tree to land on. And they all cluster in a big ball there, and the queen is somewhere in that ball. And then a bunch of scouts will go out and look for a new place to live. And they like vote democratically on where they're going to live as a group. And then once they've found their place, they will all en masse fly up and go to that new home location. And that's a way that the hive will reproduce and, yeah, make more hives out of one. And I think where Darwin caught the swarm was when they were clustered and looking for their next place to live.
Whoa.
Mm-hmm. It's such an interesting process. That's definitely why we got hooked.
So you guys are raising honeybees, though?
Yes.
So that was a swarm of honeybees. So it was from like a commercial hive that would have been branching out?
I think it was from somebody's backyard hive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a hobbyist's backyard hive. Yeah.
Whoa.
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool. I feel like we could talk about bees like all day.
For sure.
Don't
want to get too sidetracked.
Yeah, going back to your work with Squamish can you tell me a little bit more about what your role was and what your day-to-day looked like and the kinds of projects that Squamish can is working on?
For sure. And a direction I'd like to talk about for sure is the food policy work that we were doing, which was very important, I think. But so I started out being just a director at large on the board. And then a project had just started at an elementary school, Mamcombe Elementary, to have an edible schoolyard. So there's about 30 raised garden beds and a shed. And I became manager of that project after volunteering with it for a little bit. The previous manager was moving away. So I was working on the hands-on kind of growing and educating kids about growing food and eating food. But I think maybe even before that, the first project that I was tasked with was presenting this food charter that had been developed by the community, presenting that to the District of Squamish Council and asking them to adopt it as a charter of their own. And a food charter is essentially a document that lists all of the values related to the food system that community has. And the Squamish's food charter was developed a few years before I had got involved with Squamish Can by Krystle TenBrink and Katie Peace and a huge group of community members facilitated by Vancouver Coastal Health and tons of people. And they had just identified everything that they valued in the community. So I think the overarching vision is that all members of Squamish have access to safe, affordable, culturally relevant, sustainable food, and then it kind of gets more detailed from there. So I quickly learned what a food charter was, presented it to council for the second time. It had been presented a few years earlier, and I think council was excited about it, but there was it might have been a bit too early for its time. The council and staff, I don't think really knew what to do with it, and there was a lot of interest to like adopt it or endorse it, but people didn't really know what to do. So I think that time the charter just kind of got left by the wayside and forgotten about. So it was my job to present it again and really make sure that we were clear on what the process was so we could advise the council on how to adopt it properly. So in the end, it did become adopted as a District of Squamish food charter, which was wonderful. So that was kind of the first step in getting in the food policy stuff that I've been working on in Squamish. After that, we learned about food policy councils. I think we were at Vancouver Coastal Health celebration. They're one of our big funders for Squamish Can. And we were at an event that they were putting on, and we learned about food charters. We met Brent Mansfield, who was with the BC Food Systems Network, big food policy council player in the province. And he kind of got us thinking, what if we had a food policy council in Squamish? Like, what can a food policy council do? It seems like it would be a good time to have one now that we had the food charter in place. So we did a bit more research on that, kind of convened. We had a big kickoff event to convene the mayor, a bunch of council, farmers, people from the food bank, Helping Hands, a bunch of food system players from all aspects of the food system, from production to distribution and waste. And Brent presented at that and just told us a bit about what a food policy council is, what it can do. And we all kind of agreed that we should have one. And we identified a few big areas that we wanted to move towards as a community. And we identified a bunch of gaps that we had and kind of just started brainstorming on how we could address those. And then it just kind of grew from there. Squamish Can has an amazing relationship with the District of Squamish. It's fantastic. We were working with a few planners and a council member in particular, and they were so supportive in the work that we were doing. They were almost coaching us too. We were all learning together, but it was just a great relationship to kind of get a lot done in a small amount of time. And it was great timing too, because the District of Squamish was rewriting their official community plan, the OCP. So it was a great time to get a bunch of food policy language and values into that document, because the official community plan is kind of like a guidebook for how the community will develop over the next several years. So that was perfect timing. We worked really hard as a community to make sure there's a ton of food system language in there to benefit our community and would help the food system move forward in the future.
Yeah. What can you tell me about your work with Young Agrarians?
Yes. So now I'm working with Young Agrarians, which is a national charity that helps new and young farmers get into the ecological farming industry and provides business tools, land matching services because land is so expensive. There's a ton of things that Young Agrarians does to help farmers. And I started with them in December of 2018 as their community manager. So I do communications, their social media, newsletters, website, that kind of thing. And I'm also planning a few events, mostly their summer event series right now, which is on-farm tours and potlucks because it's such a good way to learn and build community. So the move to Young Agrarians was a bit strategic. I had been a fan of the organization for a long time, and when that job came up, it seemed like a great opportunity to further narrow in my interests in using agriculture and food production as a way to mitigate climate change. Agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, but it also has such potential when it's done properly, regeneratively. It has such potential to capture carbon even and combat climate change while growing food for people. So I think it's a win-win, and that really excites me.
Mm-hmm. Just a quick clarifying question. What's the difference between a nonprofit and a charity in a Canadian context?
Yeah, good question. I'm not totally sure of all the nitty-gritties, but charity has a stricter set of rules, and it can open you up to more, this is kind of more functionally, charity makes you eligible for more grants and private donations too, since you can offer charity receipts for taxes for people. So it can be a big boon. It's a lot more work reporting, especially financial reporting, and there are some stricter rules that you need to follow in terms of political activity. But it's definitely a big boon for a lot of organizations. But a ton of work to get to be filed as a charity. It's a big process.
Right. But then beneficial long-term for that organization's financial goals, potentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
Okay. I'm wondering if you could explain to me kind of what the role that these nonprofits that you've been a part of play in the food system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'll start with Squamish Can, Climate Action Network, because it is more of a small-scale grassroots organization that has worked with the local government on the municipal level, and then also done a bunch of small-scale food projects like the community gardens and the school gardens. I think food nonprofits are very important for our food system because they can fill a ton of gaps that the government isn't addressing. Like the food bank, for example, too, like fills a huge gap in how people are accessing enough food to eat. With our food policy work with Squamish Can, we were in a unique position in that we were able to help the local government. We kind of were able to do or facilitate a lot of their community outreach kind of on a deeper level than they might have been able to do on their own, just because we had so many community contacts already. Squamish Can is a great convener of people. So that worked out really well. And then because we got some grant funding to be able to work on food policy through Squamish Can, we were able to do a lot of the actual work to like research into different policies and vision statements that we should include in the official community plan. So we were actually taking work off of the government planners' plates, which was pretty cool because they're so tapped already. They were working on so many things. So that was a real concrete way that we could kind of extend the abilities of the local government to make a really awesome official community plan. So that was pretty cool. In the Young Agrarians space, I'm still learning about everything that they do, I guess, kind of more on a behind the scenes level. Young Agrarians does also get Ministry of Agriculture funding. So I guess in the same way, they're able to fill a lot of gaps that the government isn't able to fill. One of the coolest programs, I think, is the BC Land Matching Program. Because farmland is so expensive in British Columbia, especially right now, it is cost prohibitive for young farmers to get into the industry. So we have a ton of aging farmers, like the majority of our farming population in Canada is aging and over the age of 55, I believe. And those people are not going to want to farm forever. They're going to retire soon. And ideally, we would have other young farmers to take their place and keep their farmland in production rather than that land being so expensive that the only people who can afford it are property developers or people who are not working farming, because farming is not always the most lucrative business that you can do. So anyway, the BC Land Matching Program connects farmland owners with farmers who are seeking land and helps them set up very solid and sound lease agreements, usually longer than 1 year. The longer, the better for security for everybody. And they also help with some business planning advice and referrals. So the new or young farmer can kind of get a really good foundation into their new business. So that's an exciting thing that the BC Ministry of Agriculture has been really in support of in the last several years, which is quite exciting. And it's something I don't think they have the capacity for right now. So Young Agrarians fills a big gap in that way.
Yeah, that gap is huge. Do you know if a lot of the farmers that are utilizing the land matching program are first generation?
I think a lot of them are. That's a good question. I don't know the stats on that, but I know that a lot of the people who are getting into farming now are first generation. And I think any farmers who are not first generation might have farmland in their family that they would be able to take over, whereas it's not as common with first generation farmers. Mm-hmm. That's my sense of it.
Yeah. When you talk about the gaps that exist within the food system, what are the challenges of the food system that these nonprofits are trying to help solve?
Mm-hmm. I think they really vary. With Squamish Can, with the school garden, for example, we were trying to educate young people about where their food comes from and healthy eating, all that kind of thing, which is often lacking in the elementary school curriculum. So we felt that that was an important thing to address. With the also like community gardens, it's similar, just with adults usually, not kids is the sole focus. With the food charter, and the official community plan, we were addressing so many gaps in all aspects of the food system, from production to access and waste and all of that. So it really varies. And that was the most challenging thing, I think, to wrap my head around when I was getting into food system work, is how big it is. Like, it touches pretty much every industry, every activity that is going on. And is in so many different sectors. So it can be kind of overwhelming to learn about at first, or even just pick a topic to focus on. But they are all connected. And for me, coming at it with a climate change lens, I think the food production was maybe the part I was most interested in, because it seemed like it could have the most positive impact for climate change mitigation. But yeah, food systems are so big.
Yeah, it's so big. It's everything, right? I'm wondering
Totally.
How effective do you think nonprofits are at addressing these challenges?
I think it really depends on funding, is probably the most important thing, and sustainable funding that doesn't just go away after a year or two. So sustainable funding and flexible funding. So many funders, they are very specific about what you can spend their monies on, whether it's only capital projects, for example, or only wages. It's so much more effective if they can trust the nonprofit to spend their money wisely, in my opinion. And it's really that long-term funding to pay people to create those long-term relationships, like our relationship with local governments, that has been able to make such a big and more long-lasting impact. I have come across the opinion of some people that people working in nonprofits or charities should only ever be volunteers. And I think that shows not a total understanding of how these organizations work, because it is such important work, and people get burnt out if they're just volunteering. It's not really a sustainable way to make change. So if we can pay the people who are working in nonprofits a living wage, then they are much less likely to get burnt out, and they can continue doing this really important work. So yeah, fundraising, I think, or funding is the biggest, most important piece.
I'm wondering what your day-to-day looks like when you're working in a nonprofit.
I'll start with Squamish Can again, because it was a bit more interesting in my day-to-day, just more varied. I was working a lot of different jobs. I think I was working like 4 different jobs at the time, so it was a bit chaotic, but it was still Mostly communications, like via email and phone with people. So I'd have lots of projects on the go and was coordinating meetings and sometimes like writing grants in collaboration with a few other board members and writing reports and just coordinating a lot of different things that needed to happen. Squamish Can was great because I was doing that computer work for part of my job, and then for the other part of my job I was outside actually gardening and working with people. So that was fantastic. There is so much behind the scenes work I think that people don't realize. Like the fundraising takes up a huge amount of time. Sometimes grant applications are so long and so extensive. And you really want to do a good job because it's so much energy. You want to give yourself your best shot at getting a grant. So that job, it really varied. And it was fun because I also got to come up with some of my own new projects that I thought would benefit the community and had the feedback too to support that. Like the Squamish Seed Library I started a couple years ago with a great group of folks, and the associated event, CD Sunday. So that was kind of another way to improve the food security of our town by encouraging people to save their own seeds, which helps them become more locally adapted to our region. Like the strongest and best plants, you'd save those seeds from. So eventually we could even have our own Squamish varieties. So that was a really fun project that I got to work on, and I'm so grateful I had the freedom to do that. But that involved lots of meetings with community members and lots of big picture planning and visits to the printing shop, that kind of thing. So it was really varied. My work with Young Agrarians, now that I just have one job, which is nice, is mostly computer-based. So I will check my email in the morning, check our social media accounts to see if we got any replies or comments that I need to reply to. Right now I'm working on a lot of strategy documents to kind of, we will be doing this process bigger this summer too, but kind of audit where our communications are at and how we can improve and be more strategic about where we're spending our energy. And then because I'm coordinating this summer on-farm event series, I get to chat on the phone with farmers to plan cute little fun events on their farms. So that breaks things up a little bit. And I get to go to some of these events too, which is awesome. So yeah, a lot more computer-based for the job I'm doing now.
What are some of the challenges of working in nonprofits?
I almost want to say funding again is a challenge. Our executive director at Young Agrarians is amazing at fundraising and has created some great funding relationships that are long-term. But still, you kind of never really know what's going to happen when you're relying on outside funding sources. So that's probably the most tenuous thing about nonprofit work. That's also a big reason why a lot of organizations are moving towards charities, because they can do a bit more of their own fundraising and get money from private donors, which is huge. It's just so much more security, a lot more work too sometimes, but I think it can be worth it. Yeah, I'd say that's the biggest issue probably is not knowing necessarily if I'm going to have a job after my contract ends. I mean, I think with organizations that have been around a while and are more established, it's less tenuous, but I think that's always a concern.
Definitely. What do you enjoy about the work that you're doing right now?
I love how it is so values-based, and I do really feel like I'm an integral part of the work that the organization is doing. If ever I get tired of being on Facebook all day or I get overwhelmed with the number of emails I have, I just kind of think back to how important the work is that we're doing as a team and how needed it is for the future of our planet and our people. And it's so easy for me to make that connection. So that really helps. It's yeah, it's just, I really believe that it's so, so important.
What do you hope your work with nonprofits will accomplish?
With Young Agrarians, I hope that that work accomplishes bringing more new successful farms into the industry who are doing really well, mitigating climate change with their practices, and that there's a great supportive group of farmers who can help each other with the challenges that we're going to face with climate change mostly, I think. I think Young Agrarians has already been doing so much of that great work over the past 8 or so years that they've been in existence. And I think that they'll just continue to do better. So I think they're well on their way towards those goals.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about the types of farming that Young Agrarians is supporting, you've talked about regenerative agriculture. Do they support any conventional methods of farming, or is it generally farmers that are working in the sustainable agriculture movement?
That is a good question. Mostly it's ecological agriculture. So whether that's organic or regenerative or somehow a step beyond the conventional ways of farming with tons of pesticides and synthetic inputs. I think we do want to support any kind of farmer who is trying to do good things, And I mean, growing food conventionally is still awesome and so important. But I think we can do better. So Young Agrarians is really trying to focus on the ecological farmers and farming methods.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm actually not totally sure what if we had a conventional farmer who wanted to access our services. I'm not sure if we would turn them away necessarily. But yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more to what ecological farming is, and if there's some underlying principles, or what does it mean to be ecologically farming?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of a wishy-washy term, I guess. Well, or just broad term, ecological farming. It can mean a lot of different things. I think, to me anyway, I guess we could look up a definition, but to me it means farming with the larger environment in mind. So whether you are practicing no-till or low-till methods to try and keep more carbon in the ground, caring about your soil health, caring about your water health, so less runoff. It makes your soil and your farm more resilient to droughts and flooding. Using organic principles would fall under the ecological farming umbrella. Regenerative, which is also kind of a big umbrella term as well. I think permaculture, biodynamic, these are all kind of words or ways of farming that would fall under the ecological farming umbrella. It doesn't necessarily need to be an organic farm, I guess. That's kind of a more defined term. And I guess not all organic agriculture is necessarily ecological, really, in my mind. Big scale industrial agriculture, I think, is better than conventional agriculture, but can still leave a lot to be desired. I mean, ideally, all farms would be focusing on the health of their soil and capturing carbon in that soil. I think that's the golden standard to aim for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we've talked about, I guess, climate change and the environmental challenges that the food system is facing now. What do you think are some of the other challenges of the food system in the 21st century?
Mm-hmm. I think they're still kind of related. Well, I'll stick on the production side of things for a little bit. In BC, we rely on California for a lot of our food. And with a changing climate, I think we're not going to be able to rely on them as much. BC could become like our environment could become a bit more conducive to farming. We could have more of a California-like climate, which could potentially be good for agriculture. But probably we will just see more extreme weather events, more droughts, more forest fires, which impacts production as well. So I think the price of food might go up because of that, which could make it less accessible to people who are lower income. I don't really know what the future challenges of the food system will be. I think there's a lot of predictions, but I think it can be hard to know for sure. But I think if everyone tried to learn more about how farming could happen that is more resilient to these changes, I think we'd be in a better place and be able to feed our population better, not just the people who can afford vegetables.
Right.
I honestly don't have high expectations. I kind of am thinking hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. I really don't know what our ecosystem and our climate is going to be like in the next few decades. So I think it should really be all hands on deck for learning how to farm and produce food that is better able to withstand the weird climate and weather patterns that we're going to experience, just so we have enough food for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we think about our food system right now and the processes that are in place to get food, like from the ground to the people and like the production, distribution, retailing, all of that, what do you think the challenges in a BC context are for the food system today?
For BC today, there's so many issues. Just from like an access point of view, we still have so many people who are accessing food banks and emergency food services. I think that is a great indicator of how our food system needs to be improved. We still have so many people who are not able to afford or access healthy, nutritious food. That's a huge issue. And I think it's hard to necessarily pinpoint the root cause of that. Probably bigger issues like capitalism and colonialism are to blame. But I think that's a huge area that we need to address, and I don't know how long it's going to take to necessarily fix that, or if it's ever going to get fixed, or if it's just going to get worse. So yeah, that's a huge issue. Yeah, as I mentioned before too, just California's changing climate. We get our food from so many other places other than BC. I think that's a bit of a sketchy scenario to be in if those countries aren't producing food that we can access anymore. Yeah, I'd say there's a lot of issues. Waste. There's so much food waste that is happening everywhere. That is a huge resource that we could be tapping into or mitigating. Even connected like plastic waste from food, packaging waste is huge. Just all of the fossil fuels that go into making food packaging. I think there's a lot of places to improve. So I've kind of picked my one that I'm tackling right now, which I recommend anyone who doesn't know where to start in the food system is just pick something you're passionate about and just work on it, because all of the issues are connected. And I think that's the best way to get things done is just work on something that you're passionate about and you'll do a way better job.
Mm-hmm. Which that kind of leads me into my next question, which is, what do you think we should be doing? How should we be addressing these challenges?
As just like as citizens or in or like a nonprofit or governments or all of
Like,
the above?
All of the above, yeah.
How should we be addressing these challenges? I'll start with citizen level, because maybe most of the people who are listening to this podcast would just be maybe not necessarily someone who's that involved in working in the food system yet. But I think all of us need to be working towards change from two perspectives. There's the ground up way of making change, so grassroots, which includes like the personal changes that we can make in our day-to-day. So we can choose to go to a farmer's market and buy food there that is organically grown, ecologically grown, or grow some of our own food in our backyard if we can, select food with less packaging, that kind of thing. And then there's the top-down approaches, which includes pressuring our elected officials to make change as well. So we've kind of, with the grassroots change, we've kind of got this groundswell of people making changes in their daily lives, paired with the policy changes coming down from the top. I think that's a great way that change can happen. I think we need both. I don't think focusing on one is the answer. So I think if citizens can pressure their elected officials via letters are still really effective. They seem to be kind of outdated, but the stats I've heard is that a letter counts for like 50 emails or something. It's so much more meaningful to policymakers when they get an actual hard copy letter in the mail with somebody saying their views. I've heard faxes are also really good because they gum up the fax lines, which government still has, and phone calls also. But online petitions are great too. Showing up to rallies, volunteering for an organization to encourage people to vote, I think is also important, especially encouraging young people to vote, because often young people will vote for the more progressive candidates who will hopefully be leaders in actually making change, not just continuing to support big business that is not mitigating climate change at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think those are a couple of things that the average citizen can totally do. It's so easy to get bogged down by how big the food system issues are and climate change issues are. But I think just pick one thing and stick to it. All the issues are connected. So, yeah, I think that's a good way.
I'm wondering if we could dive in a little more into your interest in climate change and where that came from.
Yeah, good question. I've been thinking about that prior to this interview as well. I think I have my mom to blame for a lot of that. She was involved in a few different nonprofits on the Sunshine Coast where I grew up. And when me and my sister were really young, she would be blockading areas that were going to get logged. And so she would literally wrap us up in blankets and carry us out to the car at like 5 a.m. to go drive up these logging roads and blockade with a group of people. I remember this logger guy would come in. I guess it was just one guy at the time, but even as a young child, I remember I hated him, which he was not a bad person, but as a kid, you kind of see that one face as like the evil person who's going to cut down all the trees. For the record, I don't think that loggers or forestry people are evil at all. Everybody needs jobs. But I think that kind of thing, like blockading from age 6, where I wasn't really doing anything, but I was still there, primed me for knowing about climate change issues. And my mom was a really great example for showing that a citizen can make change. I don't actually know if that area ever got logged or not, but I don't think it did. It was a critical habitat to the marbled murrelet bird. and like old growth trees, I believe. So I think it was really important that that area got protected. And my mom also, we had a little hobby farm growing up. My mom also is a seed saver. Very into zero waste and organic food and all that kind of thing. So I think that's where my passion started. And she supported me in any activism work I was doing also later in my life. So I think that's where my foundation started. But I've studied that a bit at Quest too. Like, what are the critical ingredients that somebody needs to be able to advocate for something? And I think it's really complicated, but I think having those early life connections to the natural environment or having a good role model is so important. Which is why I think the Mamquam Edible Schoolyard that Squamish Can was running is just so important. Like, get those kids connected to their environment and their food system, and I think they're much more likely to fight for those things in the future.
Mm-hmm. What was your question?
Yeah, my question was, what is environmental education? So I investigated what effective models of environmental education looked like, what's the difference between indoctrination and education, and looked at some of those models for environmental behavior. And I think what I learned is we kind of know the basics of what, or potentially the basics of what might make people recycle, for example, but we still don't really know that much. One of the biggest things that stuck with me, though, was the importance of tone in environmental messaging. And somebody is a lot more likely to do an environmentally friendly behavior if you approach them positively about it. So you don't want to make them feel scared and you don't want to make them feel guilty. Empowering them that they can do the change and that it's a really good thing is the most effective way. So I try to employ that with my educational outreach these days, while also balancing that with making sure people have the facts, because people need to understand the issues to make the change too. But yeah, always try to keep things positive for the most part.
When we're thinking about what's at stake with the food system and educating people about the environmental impacts of our current farming practices and why we should be using ecological farming, what is at stake? Like, why, if you're talking to an average consumer, why should they care about the food system and supporting ecological farming?
Mm-hmm. It's tricky because I think the impacts of climate change are not necessarily immediate. And I think that's why the world is in its situation it's in, is because it's hard to really envision the impacts that might take place like in a generation. It's almost good that a lot of the research that's coming out now shows that we will have big impacts in our lifetimes. I hope that will help people change, not to scare them into paralysis. But so what's at stake, I think, is huge climate events, weird weather things that maybe we get like a hailstorm in July, like just happened in Guadalajara, I think in Mexico. And everybody's crops for that year are just decimated. So where do we get our food from now? I think we could be facing, so not to be totally like apocalyptic doom and gloom, but I honestly do think we could and probably will be faced with those situations in the near future, like couple decades for sure. So I think it's a very serious issue to be thinking about. We could have huge infestations of invasive species like locust kind of things as the climate shifts. I think it's definitely something to take seriously so we're not facing huge food shortages. Yeah, I think there's a lot at stake.
Mm-hmm. A question I got posed with recently that I'm struggling to answer, so I'm going to throw it to you.
Great.
Is I was giving a presentation and talking about like how it's difficult for consumers to answer the question where their food comes from. And at the end of the presentation, Jeff Warren, who's like a professor at Quest, was like, you're kind of making this assumption that it would be valuable or good for some reason for people to know where their food comes from. And I think there is value in people having an understanding of the processes of food production. And I'm wondering if you think that as well, and if so, why?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I think it's important for people to know where their food comes from and how it's getting to them and being grown, because then they can be better advocates for asking for change. Maybe that's just my activism side showing through. Actually, it's one of those ingredients towards environmentally friendly behaviors. People need to have the knowledge of the issue before they can act on it. So that's one of the critical ingredients. So I think it's really important for people to know where their food is coming from, and how it's being grown. Maybe there is more focus on the where it's coming from. That's maybe not even necessarily as much of an issue as the growing practices and how it's getting to you. Because, yeah, it's fine if all our food comes from California, or places in Africa, aside from the fossil fuel burning that it takes to get that food to us. But, yeah, if we had that food source indefinitely and it was really secure, I think that would be fine. I think having a global food system is not necessarily a bad thing, but just realizing the impacts of that and how it's probably less than ideal because a lot of the places we're getting our food from, we might not be able to get food from there in the near future. So I think the more people know that, the better, because things do need to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a good answer.
Yeah, I don't know if that's...
Yeah, it's an interesting question to think about. I'm wondering, kind of going back to thinking about your work with nonprofits and your honey business, what are your goals for your own personal engagement with the food system?
I would like to be farming full-time or almost full-time. Right now, we're just doing it part-time, but it's something that I really enjoy, and I think farming responsibly is really important, and I would like to be a part of that. So I guess it goes back to find something that you're passionate about and do it, because you'll be the best at that if you're passionate about it. So that's the direction I'm going right now. I might never stop working for a nonprofit or having another side job just for the financial stability of it, but I would like to be farming more full time.
What type of farming would you be doing?
The beekeeping is so interesting to us, and I think we are starting to be in a position that we can help the industry become more sustainable through having more locally adapted stock, that kind of thing. Another thing with climate change and just how we're screwing up our environment is I think we will increasingly have to rely on honeybees for pollination for a lot of crops. We do already rely on them so heavily, but in a lot of areas we have native pollinators who are actually oftentimes better pollinators than honeybees just because they have different body shapes and different ways of pollinating. So I think we're going to have to rely more on honeybees. And honeybees are not really as much in danger of going extinct like a lot of native bee species are, or have already gone extinct. But they're still dying so much, like crazy levels, which I don't think is really sustainable long term. And like currently in Canada, we get a lot of our bees from Australia and New Zealand and Chile and queens from Hawaii. we don't know if those areas will be able to supply us in the future. And honeybees are not really well adapted to living in Canada, I don't think. I think this last year was a big die-off, especially for people in BC, but probably the rest of the country as well. So I think contributing towards making sure that our food gets pollinated, so producing a lot of our foods need pollination, like potatoes, not so much, because we don't usually grow them from seed, but like squash, tomatoes, lots of different things need pollination to produce food, and then also to produce seeds that we're able to grow the following year. So that feels like another important piece, the beekeeping piece, that I'd like to keep working on.
Mm-hmm.
I would also like to get into growing more vegetables and herbs, but I think that'll be a bit of a side project.
I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would like to talk about that I haven't asked you.
I feel like that might be it. I feel like I've been chatting for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Marika. So fun.
Yeah, it was
Thanks
great to hear your perspective and how you're thinking about the food system these days and the challenges that we're facing. I think it'll be fun for us in like 20 years to listen back to this podcast and see what our climate is like and if our predictions about the food system were correct or not.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we'll see. But thank you so much. It was really great to have you. And
thanks for having me.
I'm going to...
I actually did think of one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe you can weave this in earlier. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize is how important working with local governments is. I think it can be intimidating for people to address how the government of Canada is making its decisions. You know, it's a lot harder for one person to influence the government of Canada's policies and law. But local governments is a lot less intimidating to get into and to advocate in. We've had such great success with Squamish Can working with our local counselors and staff and planners. They are so awesome. It's such a great place to start. And I think it's not just small potatoes. I think it does really make a difference because if we have a bunch of municipalities declaring climate emergencies, having really friendly food policy, that kind of creates a sea change of provinces doing the same thing, and then countries doing the same thing, and then hopefully the world doing the same thing. So I think it's a lower barrier place to start, and I've learned so much from working with local governments too. So it's a great place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think like systemic problems need policy change.
Yeah.
To solve them.
Totally.
Like having consumers just vote with their fork or their dollar, and the food that you eat and the things you consume, it's important to be critical of that and to be aware of what's going into production. But there's only so much you can do as an individual. Mm-hmm. And I think we need collective change, which is why I'm like making this podcast, because I'm like, I really think that in order to have collective change, we have to be on the same page about what the issues are. Mm-hmm. And right now, what we know about the food system is so dependent upon how we are engaged with it and how we can access it. So as a consumer, the information and the problems that you get to think about and that you have access to are really different than the realities of actually farming or actually working in a nonprofit. And I found that reality is distinctly different from being an academic. Mm-hmm. And the way that I've been trained to think about the food system from a social science, like academic lens, which is very removed from the realities of production, but is more the theory of like capitalism and how it does affect our farming practices. Mm-hmm. But like you need all the pieces of the puzzle to write policy change.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And that's so much to think about at once. Like it's so big.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's good. And a phrase that just popped into my mind that also is so helpful for guiding my work, and I think it's important, is think global, act local. It's very simple, but it can really help you become unparalyzed if you kind of get overwhelmed by all of the issues and these big topics.
Right. Thank you for listening to and supporting this project. I hope that it inspires you to think critically about our food system and listen openly to the perspectives of others. This episode of Savory was created on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. I am deeply humbled to have had the opportunity to live, work, and learn on this land. Creating a podcast is a highly collaborative endeavor. Financial support for Savory came from the Quest Research and Scholarly Works Committee. Savory was produced, recorded, and edited by myself, Marika Dunham, under the guidance of the incredible Dr. Davy. Original music is by Cameron Lee. You can find his work at eelromance.com. And graphic design is by Jessica Matyas. You can follow her work at Matyas Creates on Instagram.